Christmas Eve had always been my favorite time of year. The house was always warm with the scent of fresh pine from the Christmas tree, and the living room glowed with the soft flicker of lights. The excitement of the holiday had settled down for the night, and after a long day of celebrating with my family, I finally found myself lying in bed, ready to drift off into sleep. But that night was different. The clock read 1:37 a.m. when I first heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, but not quite. A soft knock at the front door. It was so quiet at first, I thought I was imagining it, or that it was just the wind tapping against the house. But then it came again, this time louder, clearer. Knock, knock, knock. I lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart starting to beat faster. The house was completely still. My parents and younger siblings were asleep in their rooms, and there was no reason for anyone to be at the door at this hour. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a stray animal bumping against the door, or the wind hitting the house in just the right way. But as I lay there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The knock came again, this time more insistent, louder. Almost like someone was deliberately trying to get my attention. It wasn't normal. It didn't feel normal. I had to check. I slowly pushed the blankets off and crept out of bed, trying not to make a sound. The floor was cold beneath my feet as I tiptoed down the dark hallway toward the front door. My breath felt heavy in the still air. Each step was agonizingly slow as the knocking echoed through the silence of the house. Louder now. Knock, knock, knock. When I reached the door, the knocking stopped and an eerie silence filled the house. It felt like the world outside had completely frozen. I stood still for a moment, hesitating. My mind raced with thoughts. Could it be a late-night carol singer, someone lost in the snow, or maybe a prank? I took a deep breath and cautiously turned the handle, opening the door just a crack. The porch was empty, not a single soul. No footprints in the snow. No sign of life. Only the soft, cold wind that blew against my face. The street was completely empty, with nothing in sight but the falling snow. I slowly closed the door, locking it securely behind me. But the feeling, the dread, was still there, gnawing at me from the inside. I couldn't shake the thought that someone or something had been at that door. It didn't feel like a normal knock. It felt deliberate, like someone wanted me to answer. I turned and started walking back down the hallway, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling in my chest. But as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A shadow. It was quick, like it was trying to remain hidden, but it was there. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one in the hallway, just a dim light flickering from the living room. But the shadow, it had been there. I blinked, but it was gone. Was I imagining things? Had I seen it wrong? I told myself to stay calm. It was probably just the way the light played with the shadows. I moved toward my room, but that's when I heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was inside the house. The sound came from the living room, faint at first, but then it grew louder, more persistent. Knock, knock, knock. It echoed through the quiet house, moving from one side to the other, like someone was walking around, tapping on walls, doors, everything. I froze in place, my blood running cold. What the hell was happening? No one else was awake. No one else was home. The house was locked tight. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, hands trembling, and tried to call my parents, but the call went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. My mind raced with questions. What was making that noise? What if someone was inside? What if? The knocking continued, now coming closer, right outside my bedroom door. It wasn't random now. It was deliberate. Someone was outside. Someone was waiting. I could feel it. I backed away from the door, holding my breath. The knocking stopped. The house fell into an unnatural silence. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give me away. And then the door creaked open just a little. I didn't open it. No one else did either. But the door, it opened on its own. I could barely see anything in the hallway. It was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim glow of the Christmas tree in the living room. I stood there in the doorway of my room, staring into the darkness. I could feel the air growing colder, the tension rising in the pit of my stomach. And that's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow playing on the wall. But no, there was someone there. It was a tall, thin figure, standing completely still, just watching. The faint glow from the Christmas lights didn't seem to reach it. It was as if the shadow was swallowing up the light around it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. Its eyes, though I couldn't fully see its face, were fixed on me. I could feel them on me, boring into my soul. Then, as if it had decided I was no longer worth its attention, the figure slowly turned and walked down the hallway. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though it was savoring my fear. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't move. The figure moved past my door, vanishing into the darkness, but the atmosphere in the house didn't shift. It was as if the air itself had frozen. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening for any sound, any sign that it was gone. The house was completely still. And then, as if the terror had never even happened, I heard the quiet, rhythmic knocking again. But this time, it didn't come from the door. It came from inside the house, from behind me, from the shadows. I bolted out of my room, running down the hall, but the door to the front entrance had already been locked. I couldn't get out. The knocking continued, louder now, as if someone was right behind me, knocking from just inches away. I rushed to the living room, only to find it empty. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner, innocent and quiet. But I knew better. The visitor hadn't left. Since that night, every Christmas Eve, I hear the knocking again. It starts soft at first, as if testing whether I'm awake, but then it grows louder and more insistent, right outside my door. And every time, I freeze. I've learned my lesson. Every year, I lock the doors, pull the covers over my head, and try to ignore the tapping at the windows, the knocking at the door. But I know deep down that it's never really gone. I don't know what it wants or why it comes, but it's waiting for me, watching, and it won't leave until I open the door. It was Christmas Eve, and my family was nestled in for the night, all cozy by the fireplace. The house was decorated with garlands and lights, and outside, a thick blanket of snow covered the ground, turning everything into a serene winter wonderland. But that night, well, that night wasn't like any other. The wind was howling outside, pushing the snow against the windows with a constant tapping sound. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the whole house smelled like pine and cinnamon. I remember feeling that peaceful Christmas spirit, you know, the kind that fills you with warmth and joy. I thought it would be another perfect holiday, but that night would haunt me forever. It all started when my younger sister, Lily, begged my parents to go outside and build a snowman. The snow had piled up deep, the perfect kind for packing and shaping into a snowman. At first, we hesitated because it was getting late, but Lily was insistent. She wanted to build it right by the window, where we could see it from inside. So we bundled up, layered ourselves in winter gear, and headed outside into the bitter cold. The snow crunched beneath our boots, and the sky was a deep velvet black. The only light came from the faint glow of our porch light, and the soft gleam of the moon reflecting off the snow. The cold nipped at our cheeks as we rolled snow into massive balls, stacking them one on top of the other to create a snowman. We gave him a scarf, a crooked carrot nose, and a pair of coal eyes. The usual stuff. But when we finished, something about it felt wrong. As I looked at our creation, I noticed that the snowman's head was tilted slightly to one side, almost as if it was watching us. I shook it off at first, telling myself it was just my imagination, but there was something unsettling about the way the snowman seemed to be staring. I didn't think much more of it though. We went back inside, shutting the door against the cold, and all went to bed shortly after. The house settled into silence. I climbed into bed, my sister Lily asleep in the room next door. The night was peaceful, the sound of the wind outside the only thing breaking the silence. But then, around 3 a.m., I woke up. I don't know why I woke up. There was no sound, no reason. But when I opened my eyes, the room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. I turned my head and glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. exactly. The house was quiet, except for that constant tapping of the wind against the window. That's when I noticed it. From the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move past the window, something large, dark, and still. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The snowman? It couldn't be. No! I had to be imagining it. The snowman was just a pile of snow, right? But when I looked closer, I could see it clearly. Standing outside, in the exact same spot where we had left it, was the snowman. But it wasn't the same. The scarf had shifted slightly. The coal eyes now seemed darker, almost more menacing. The head was turned a little further, and its body, though still made of snow, looked as if it had shifted slightly, as if it was no longer standing the way it had before. My heart raced, and I quickly pulled the covers over my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, the snow shifting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I held my breath, straining to listen to any sound from outside. The wind was still howling, but then there was again a soft creak, like footsteps crunching in the snow. I peeked out from under the covers and looked back at the window. The snowman was still there, but now it was closer, much closer. There was no way it could have moved on its own. I had to be imagining this. But as my eyes locked onto the figure, I knew something was off. My heart raced as I looked around the room, searching for any signs that I wasn't just losing my mind. The room was dark, the shadows stretching long across the walls. But then I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. It started slow at first, tap, 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 and then it picked up speed. Tap, 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 louder and faster, as if the snowman was knocking on the glass. I scrambled out of bed, my feet hitting the cold floor, and rushed to the window. I couldn't see anything clearly from inside, just the outline of the snowman against the backdrop of the moonlight. But the knocking continued. I was terrified, but I forced myself to gather enough courage to pull the curtains back. As I did, the knocking stopped, but the snowman, still standing, as though it were waiting for me, was much closer than before. Its coal eyes seemed to gleam in the darkness, and its crooked carrot nose looked more sinister than ever. And then, something strange happened. The snowman tilted its head even further, as if it were looking directly at me through the glass. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I quickly ran to Lily's room and shook her awake. Lily, you need to wake up. There's something wrong with the snowman. At first, she groggily protested, but I pulled her out of bed, dragging her to the window. When she saw the snowman, her face drained of color. She backed away, whispering, "That's not possible. We built it just like that. It can't move." I looked at her, fear bubbling up inside of me. I don't know how, but it's real. It's watching us. The wind outside howled louder, and the tapping at the window started again, even faster than before. We both jumped as the snowman's figure grew larger, more menacing in the moonlight. Then, suddenly, there was a loud scraping sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the ground. We looked down. There, in the freshly fallen snow, were deep footprints leading right up to the window. They were large, almost human-sized. And then, to our horror, the snowman's eyes moved. They shifted ever so slightly, following us as we backed away. We both ran to my parents' room, but when we tried to wake them, we found that they were gone. The bed was empty, the sheets crumpled and cold, as if they had disappeared in the middle of the night. We were alone. Panicked, I rushed back to the window and pulled the curtain back. The snowman was gone, not standing there anymore. It had moved. But where? Suddenly, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. That's when I heard it, another tap. This time it was coming from inside the house. I looked over at the front door. The handle turned slowly, as if someone was trying to get in. But there was no one outside. The snowman wasn't just watching us. It was in the house, and it wasn't alone. Every Christmas, my family has a tradition of getting the biggest tree we can find for our living room. My parents, especially my mom, would spend hours decorating it, arranging the lights, hanging the ornaments, and placing the angel at the very top. I always loved those moments, the house glowing with holiday cheer. It felt magical until one Christmas, everything changed. It was 3 days before Christmas, and my parents were looking for a tree. It had snowed heavily, and the air was crisp. My sister and I were excited. It was always fun going out to pick the tree, but this year felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. We drove to the tree farm, where rows upon rows of pine trees stood tall. We searched through dozens of trees, but none of them felt just right. Then, as we walked deeper into the grove, we saw it. It was the biggest tree we'd ever seen, towering above everything else. Its dark, thick branches seemed to reach out toward us, and the smell of pine was overpowering. At first, I thought it was just the sheer size of the tree that made it seem so imposing, but as we got closer, I noticed something strange. The tree wasn't like the others. The needles looked blackened, almost withered, and there was an odd, faint rustling sound coming from the branches, even though the air was still. My dad, always the optimist, said it was the wind, but I could tell he was a little uneasy too. Still, my mom insisted that it was the perfect tree. It was beautiful, she said. So, we cut it down and brought it home, the large tree barely fitting into the back of our car. That night, as we set the tree up in the living room, the odd feeling I had grown. As the tree settled into the stand, the room grew colder. It wasn't just the temperature, it was like the air itself had shifted. A heaviness seemed to fill the house, as if something was watching us. We started decorating the tree, and that's when I noticed the first weird thing. As we placed ornaments on the lower branches, I saw that the lights flickered, not like they were malfunctioning, but more like they were alive, moving on their own. I asked my mom if she saw it too, but she brushed it off, claiming it was just the cold air. But I didn't believe her. I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the oddities kept coming. I heard whispering sounds coming from the tree, faint but distinct. I thought it was the wind, but it didn't stop. It was as if the tree was speaking. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I started to feel a cold sweat on my skin. After finishing up the tree, we all sat down to watch Christmas movies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tree, with its strange rustling branches and flickering lights, seemed to loom over us. It wasn't just a tree, it felt like it had a presence. something dark. That night, I went to bed with the uneasy feeling still gnawing at me. I fell asleep quickly, but around 2 a.m., I was woken up by a sound. It was a soft, scraping sound coming from downstairs. I listened, my heart pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a normal sound. I crept out of bed and tiptoed downstairs, clutching a flashlight. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze. The tree, it was moving. The branches were swaying gently, though there was no breeze. The lights flickered in a pattern I couldn't explain. It was almost hypnotic, like the tree was alive. I stepped forward, but as I did, I heard something that froze me in place. A low, guttural whisper. Leave before it's too late. I dropped the flashlight in shock, and the beam rolled across the floor, illuminating the tree. And that's when I saw it. There, nestled in the branches, was a dark shape. It looked like a figure, a face, hidden among the needles, watching me. I screamed, turning to run back upstairs, but when I glanced back, the face was gone. The tree was still. The room was eerily silent. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my parents what happened. Of course, they didn't believe me. My dad just said it was a bad dream, and my mom blamed it on stress. But I knew what I had seen, and the tree, there was something wrong with it. That day, things took a darker turn. It started with small things. The ornaments would go missing, only to reappear somewhere else in the house. The lights on the tree flickered more often, casting strange shadows across the room. I heard faint whispers again. Sometimes it sounded like voices, other times like laughter. But it wasn't friendly laughter. It was malicious, mocking, as if the tree was toying with us. That evening, while we were eating dinner, the house went completely silent, and I noticed something strange. The tree had grown even darker. The once bright pine needles had darkened to a deep, almost black shade, and the branches were drooping unnaturally low. Suddenly, the lights went out. The entire house was plunged into darkness, and my parents started to panic. My dad tried to find the fuse box, but it wasn't working. The power wasn't just out. There was something blocking it, something unnatural. In the darkness, I heard the whispers again. Leave. It will never leave. You're not safe. I tried to call for help, but the phone lines were dead. Panic set in as I realized the tree was not just cursed, it was alive, and it was controlling everything in the house. We tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't open. The house had become a prison. It was like the tree had trapped us inside. In the middle of the night, I went to check on Lily. She was awake, staring at the ceiling. When I asked her what was wrong, she whispered, "The tree, it's watching us." I went to the living room and found the tree towering in the corner. But it wasn't just watching us. It was moving, shifting in a way that wasn't natural. The lights flashed on and off, and the whispers grew louder. I knew what I had to do. We couldn't keep living like this. The tree wasn't just cursed. It was alive, feeding off our fear. It wanted something from us, something dark. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and made my way to the tree. With a trembling hand, I reached up and slashed at the trunk. At first, nothing happened. But then, the tree let out a screeching sound, like metal scraping against metal. The branches shook violently, and the lights flickered wildly. The whispers turned into screams. Painful, agonizing, as if the tree was in torment. And then all at once, the tree collapsed. The lights went out. The house was silent. We ran out of the house that night, never looking back. We never spoke of the tree again. My parents eventually sold the house, and we moved far away. But every Christmas, when the snow starts to fall, I remember that cursed tree, the one that watched us, the one that nearly took us all. And I know that somewhere out there, it's waiting for someone else to bring it into their home. So, if you ever find a tree that's too perfect, too dark, too strange, just remember the story. It's never just a tree. It was just a few days before Christmas, and the festive spirit was in full swing in our small, cozy home. The scent of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, lights twinkled on the tree, and cheerful carols played softly in the background. Everything felt perfect, except for one thing, the elf. You've probably heard of the elf on the shelf. That little toy meant to watch over children and report their behavior back to Santa. My mom had picked one up earlier that month and placed it on the mantle above the fireplace. At first, it was just a harmless decoration, something to amuse my younger brother, Jamie. But over the past few days, something about the elf started to feel off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way its painted eyes seemed to follow me whenever I passed the mantle, or the unnerving smile that felt less cheerful and more sinister. Jamie loved it though. He named it Buddy and would talk to it every night before bed, telling it what he wanted for Christmas. I shrugged it off as my imagination. After all, it was just a doll, or so I thought. The night everything changed, the house was quiet. My parents were upstairs wrapping gifts, and Jamie was fast asleep. I was curled up on the couch, scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint thud coming from the living room. At first, I ignored it, assuming it was the house settling or the wind outside. But then it happened again, a distinct sound like something falling. Reluctantly, I got up to check. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of the Christmas tree. Everything seemed normal at first glance. But then I noticed it. Buddy was no longer on the mantle. He was on the coffee table. I froze. My first thought was that Jamie had moved him, but that didn't make sense. Jamie was in bed, and my parents would never touch the elf. They were adamant about keeping the magic alive. Uneasy, I picked up the elf and placed him back on the mantle. "It's just a doll," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. But as I turned to leave the room, I swear I heard a faint giggle. The following morning, Jamie was ecstatic. He ran into the kitchen, clutching Buddy in his tiny hands. Buddy moved. He came to my room last night. Jamie chirped, his eyes wide with excitement. "What do you mean, he came to your room?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He was sitting on my nightstand when I woke up. Jamie said, "He's watching over me, just like he's supposed to." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to scare Jamie, so I forced a smile and told him to put Buddy back on the mantle. But inside, I was starting to feel genuinely uneasy. That night, I made sure to place Buddy on the mantle before going to bed. I even snapped a picture to reassure myself. But when I woke up around 2 a.m., I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. I tiptoed downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the Christmas lights. And there, sitting on the edge of the couch, was Buddy. This time, his head was tilted slightly, his painted smile seeming wider than before. I slowly backed away, my breaths coming in shallow gasps. That's when I noticed something else. Tiny footprints in the snow outside the window. They led from the porch to the living room window, but there were no tracks leading back. I slammed the curtains shut and ran back upstairs, locking my bedroom door behind me. The next day, I tried to convince my parents to get rid of the elf, but they just laughed it off, saying I was overreacting. That night, I decided to stay awake and keep an eye on Buddy. I positioned myself on the couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around me, and waited. For hours, nothing happened. The house was silent, and Buddy remained motionless on the mantle. Just when I started to feel foolish for being so paranoid, the clock struck midnight. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder. The Christmas lights flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. And then, ever so slowly, Buddy turned his head. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. His painted eyes locked onto mine, and his smile seemed to stretch impossibly wide. "Why are you watching me?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. And then, in a voice that was soft yet chilling, Buddy replied, "Because I like you." I don't remember much after that. My parents found me the next morning, curled up on the floor, clutching the elf. They thought I had a nightmare, but I knew the truth. Buddy was gone after that. My parents said they misplaced him, but I think they got rid of him after seeing how terrified I was. Jamie cried for days, asking where Buddy had gone, but I didn't care. All I knew was that I never wanted to see that elf again. Even now, years later, I can't look at an elf on the shelf without feeling a cold knot of fear in my chest. Because every time I do, I swear I can hear that faint giggle echoing in the back of my mind. It was Christmas Eve and our small, snow-covered town was eerily silent. The streets, usually bustling with last-minute shoppers and cheerful festivities, were deserted. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind weaving through the empty lanes. A thick fog blanketed the town, muting the twinkle of Christmas lights and casting an oppressive stillness over everything. My family had decided to spend the evening together, exchanging stories and sipping hot cocoa by the fireplace. It was meant to be a peaceful night, but there was an unshakable tension in the air, a feeling that something was off. That night, my parents went to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room. The crackling of the fire and the soft ticking of the clock were the only noises. I was just about to head upstairs when I heard it, a faint melodic hum. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then the hum grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of singing, soft, mournful carols drifting through the night. I peered out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. At the end of our street, barely visible through the fog, stood a group of figures. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, long cloaks, bonnets, and top hats, and they stood in a perfect semicircle under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Their voices carried the haunting melody of Silent Night, but there was something unsettling about their tone. It was slow and drawn out, almost like a lament. I stared at them, my pulse quickening. Carolers weren't uncommon in our town, but something about these figures felt wrong. They didn't move, didn't sway or shift like people normally would while singing. They were unnaturally still. Against my better judgment, I cracked the window open slightly, letting the cold night air seep in. The singing grew louder, but as I listened more closely, I realized something horrifying. They weren't singing in English. The words were guttural and harsh, a language I couldn't recognize. Yet the melody was unmistakably that of Silent Night. I slammed the window shut, my hands trembling. I decided to wake my parents, but when I reached their room, I found them fast asleep, their breathing steady and undisturbed. Shaking them didn't help. They wouldn't wake up, no matter how hard I tried. Panic began to creep in. I returned to the living room, hoping the carolers had moved on. But when I looked out the window again, my heart nearly stopped. They were closer. Now they stood in the middle of our street, their faces still obscured by the fog. I could see them more clearly, though. Their clothes were tattered, their posture stiff and unnatural. And their singing, it had changed. The melody was faster now, more aggressive, as if urging me to come outside. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard it, a knock at the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks echoed through the house. I froze, staring at the door. The singing outside stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. Through the tiny glass circle, I saw nothing but fog. No carolers, no shadows, just an empty porch. But then I heard a whisper, faint but distinct, coming from the other side of the door. "Come join us." The voice was cold and hollow, sending shivers down my spine. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The knocking resumed, faster this time, more insistent. And then, without warning, the power went out. The lights flickered once before plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight and backed toward the stairs. As I did, I heard the sound of footsteps, soft, shuffling steps moving around the outside of the house. I darted upstairs, locking myself in my bedroom. From my window, I could see the carolers again. They were now in our yard, standing in a perfect circle around a single patch of untouched snow. Their faces were still hidden, but their heads were tilted upward, as if they were staring directly at me. The singing began again, louder and more distorted than before. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The voices outside grew louder, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I barricaded the door with my desk, my heart racing as I heard the creaking of floorboards downstairs. The carolers were inside. Their song echoed through the house, each note more jarring than the last. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow but deliberate, moving steadily up the stairs. Suddenly, the singing stopped. A heavy silence filled the house, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. And then, a single voice spoke. "You shouldn't have listened." The doorknob began to turn, the lock rattling violently. I backed away, clutching a lamp as my only weapon. The door burst open, and for the first time, I saw their faces. They weren't human. Their eyes were hollow pits of darkness, their mouths twisted into unnatural, gaping smiles. Their skin was pale and cracked, like porcelain dolls that had been left to decay. I screamed, throwing the lamp at the closest figure. It shattered, but they didn't flinch. They advanced slowly, their bony fingers reaching out toward me. Just when I thought it was over, a blinding light filled the room. The carolers shrieked, their forms dissolving into shadows that melted into the walls. The power had come back on. I ran downstairs, my heart pounding, and found my parents awake and confused. They claimed they hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen the carolers. But when I looked outside, the circle of untouched snow was still there, surrounded by deep, unearthly footprints. To this day, I don't know who or what the carolers were, but every Christmas Eve, I hear their song faintly in the distance, a haunting reminder of that night. I've learned to ignore it, to stay inside and never look out the window, because once you listen to their song, they never really leave you.